if we want to understand phenomena like political polarization and ideological polarization. It isn't enough to simply look at the different ideas or philosophical commitments people have. You have to look at the way in which those differences are really baked into the infrastructure of people's lives.
Welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy. Marcus, on a scale of Nightmare on Elm Street to Hallmark movie, how was your Thanksgiving?
It was a terrible Netflix series. So I
Oh
don't
no.
is that maybe in the middle of my dad, unfortunately, he went to the emergency room. Thankfully he is okay, but he had some issues going on with his bladder. He
Mhm.
probably didn't want me to actually say that, but he doesn't listen to the podcast or whatever. And then my sister ended up getting COVID. And
Oh,
so it
bummer.
ended up being pajama and Netflix um, time of year for us. And so, I cuddled up with the fam and my terrier, my dog, and then my Australian kettle dog, and we watched season 5 or the first 4 episodes of season 5 of Stranger Things. And let me tell you, it's yeah, the writing has jumped the shark a little bit. I'll just say that.
Well, at
Anyway.
least your dogs were happy, probably.
No, there you go. There you go. What about yours, Nora? How was your Thanksgiving?
It was okay. It was pretty quiet. We just had my parents in town. Uh, I feel like I cracked the code on cooking for Thanksgiving though, because this is the first year where I've cooked where the dessert leftovers outlasted the dinner leftovers, and I feel like that's the way it needs to go. So, yes, for future self, I'm making a note to make like 3 times as much dessert as we think we're going to eat because that makes me happy.
That is so is it yeah, it's the case, right? The Thanksgiving dinner itself costs more, right? And you get less. But if I don't know, if you add 3 desserts to it, is it still the how does that yeah, how does that settle out in the
Well, no, it's
cost?
more just like it's like, I hate having like a 20-pound turkey to eat for a week. That just like gets really depressing. But If if you have, like, layers and layers of pie to eat all week, like, that makes for a happy post-Thanksgiving week.
That is true, right? It's like an extended dinner, right? And in some ways, it like the
The good
cost starts to
parts.
wash out. Yeah,
Yeah,
the good part. There you go.
yeah.
There you go. I like this. I like this thought
Yeah,
here.
um,
Anyhow,
well,
I
Pete Hegseth had quite the Thanksgiving, I think. Um, I feel like he not only decided to eat a couple of helpings of pie, but also decided to commit some more war crimes.
that is true. Yeah, some would call that murder as well. I think,
Yes.
unfortunately, the whole kill them all, I believe, is it's alleged that the Washington Post was reporting that he said when Um, there was a strike on a Venezuelan boat that he says, you know, unproven by the way, was carrying drugs. And they did a first strike, and then it was the second strike uh, that I believe that he was heard to have said killed them all in terms of sinking the boat. And
Jesus.
my God, you talk about somebody who is displaying very sociopathic behavior, and quite frankly, if any senator who've read his, I hesitate to call it a book, his diatribes, whatever, prior to him being sworn in as, I'm just going to call it Secretary of Defense. I'm not using the Secretary of War
No.
thing.
Yes.
They would have known that maybe this was this person's
This was his
mindset.
inclination? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so whatever. 60.
Whiskey Pete needs to stop thinking that, like, Die Hard is a Christmas movie.
I
Like,
I
sorry.
it he might, unfortunately, it might be less Die Hard, as bad as that would be to, like, I think he's watching it was it Flight Risk, which is
Ugh.
it's a Mark Wahlberg movie which my partner and I did not know was directed by Mel Gibson until the end of the movie, and we're just both like, "Oh my god, this was horrible before we knew this man directed it, but now, my lord, I want to gouge out my eyeballs for forever watching this. Anyway, sorry, that was an aside
No, you
away from what we were
you got
discussing.
Gibsoned. It happens to the best of us.
That was, but damn it, during the holiday though, my God.
I know.
Anyway,
I know.
we're all getting Gibsons, okay,
Yeah.
from the the Department of Defense to you know Marco Rubio, who was trying to glaze our president here, that giving him some Thanksgiving glazing
Mm.
um, in a recent press event, and we had our president who was seemingly falling asleep the entire time. So that's the thing. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, I do feel like Trump seems even more confused and unhinged than usual. Like he had he had this announcement about his MRI. He was like, "Oh, I got a perfect score, but I don't know what body part was happening." And then when he was asked about it further, he was like, "Oh, well, it wasn't my brain. My brain's fine, right?" Um, which like really cleared things up. And I was like thinking the whole time that like it would just be so nice if we could be like, "Okay, grandpa, let's get you back to your recliner."
I Yeah, the perfect score thing on the MRI. I was like, is that how they gauge MRIs? Does anybody want to tell them that,
What
like,
do you think he
foundationally?
thinks MRI stands for? Like I don't yeah. Anyways. Um
Well, I'm glad this person is the head of the free world. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
exactly.
very confident.
Give him some more nuclear codes, guys. It's going great. Um, also speaking of Gibsoning the holidays,
Mhm.
the White House is decorated nicely. The Christmas theme this year is construction zone chic. Um, I think we can now enjoy piles of rubble and discarded history and the seasonal music of jackhammers.
That is a thing. We can also enjoy I guess, the first lady, Melania. I mean, she seems like she wanted to be anywhere else,
Ugh.
but then, decorating air quotes, the White House. And,
Yes,
if I was her, I would also want to be anywhere else, but the White
I know.
House as well. So, I mean, I can relate to that at least.
I
I can
never
relate to
know
that.
whether to pity her or not. Like yeah. Um,
Yeah, I'm having mixed feelings. I'm having mixed feelings.
yeah.
So, whatever, whatever. Anyway, um, that being said, there's some educational news this week as well, Nora. I
Mhm.
I guess when isn't there, right? But it seems that Northwestern and the University of Oklahoma are enjoying a new rivalry, competing for the most spineless academic administrators. A professor at Oklahoma got put on leave after giving what seems like a well-deserved F to a student. The student wrote an entire essay about the biblical basis of gender roles and how the idea of multiple genders is demonic after being asked to respond to a scientific paper they read in class. So,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
when I was reading this, when I was reading this, Nora, I gotta say, like, I mean, you obviously are an educator in your day job. How that the fact that there was any level of outrage, to this in terms of, I'm not talking about the outrage to the outrage of the person getting
Mm.
death, but I mean the fact that there was any type of outrage that this person got a well-deserved F. I mean, are are we living in the dark ages again? I mean, like,
We
my God.
are. Yeah. I mean, I took the time to read the paper.
Wow.
I mean, well, I was curious. I was like, like let's give this a fair read. It was terrible. Like
Okay.
it did not answer the prompt. I mean, but I also feel like, I mean, just like congratulations to the entire University of Oklahoma for giving like every student at final exam week a total cheat code for how to write their essays. And all you have to do now is like invoke the Bible and you're going to get an A because people are scared of losing their jobs. Like, I guess we don't
I
need ChatGPT anymore.
I don't know. If somebody was able, like, writing about, I don't the Chronicles of Narnia to explain race relations, right? I mean, like, does that count now? Like, I mean, what is I just I just don't understand the precedents that this is setting other than, like, we're going to reward mythology in, very serious academic settings. Like
Yeah.
yeah, oh my God, I'm
Universities
feeling
are really in a toilet right now.
that it's
It's bad here.
it's
I
it's
don't
definitely
recommend it.
circling. Yeah, I mean, I guess mixing the metaphors, but it's certainly circling the drain. I will
Yes.
say that.
It's a better metaphor, probably.
My God, I mean, I get like something like this at PragerU. Hey, go for it, I guess, if that's your if that's what you're into. But wow, wow. I just again, these are I
Yes.
can't imagine anybody being less prepared when they enter into the real world. But then again, what is the real world
I
these
know, why pay
days?
tuition, right? Like, I mean, you can pay me a lot of money to give you A's on your little, like, Bible essays if you'd like, Like, we could just, like, cut out the middleman.
That
Um,
Jesus, I
anyways,
oh my gosh.
obviously, it is a season of hard conversations,
Yes.
whether they're happening in the classroom or with our families around the holiday dinner table. We are sort of being constantly reminded of just how far apart our beliefs and our values and our news feeds are, which is why I'm so glad that we have this conversation today.
Anand Pandian will be talking about his newest book with us, Something Between Us: The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. In this book, Anand takes an 8-year ethnographic tour across the US trying to better understand what divides Americans along political and social lines. His book focuses on the walls, both material and metaphorical, that separate us from each other, and in doing so, inhibit our ability to build stronger, more resilient, and more diverse community. And he reminds us of the many ways that Americans are also working to lower those walls, build bridges, and find ways of being more, not less, interdependent on one another.
It's such a joy to have Anand with us today. He's the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. His books include A Possible Anthropology, Methods for Uneasy Times, and most recently, his book Something Between Us. Anand serves as president of the Society for Cultural Anthropology and as a curator of the Ecological Design Collective, a community for radical ecological imagination and collaboration in Baltimore. He lives with his family in the city, where he is currently also working on a new book project on decay, waste, and the crafting of ecological futures. Well, Anand, thank you so much for being with us here today. I adore this book, and I'm really excited to chat with you about it.
Really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Um, you and I have discussed a little bit that we're talking to you during a season in which a lot of people are struggling through holiday conversations with family and friends, oftentimes with people that they don't agree with, but increasingly also that they may not even share a common reality with. You wrote this book, and in doing the research for this work, essentially survived 8 years of such conversations. um, and I guess I'm wondering, like, to start us off, what lessons do you have from that work to impart to people about how to lower those walls a little bit and begin to find some more common ground in our conversations?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for the chance to talk about the book with you all and with your listeners and your audience. It really is a privilege. When you write a book, you don't really have a sense of who you're writing it for and who's going to find it down the line when it finally comes out into the world. But the fact that folks like you have reached out with interest, having looked at the book and are interested in its ideas, it does mean a lot to me. And truly, it's a collective condition. It's a real collective difficulty that we're in right now. This challenge of finding our way back to a state of conversation and engagement with the full range of those that we share our societies with in a manner that reflects that diversity adequately, in a manner that acknowledges those differences of opinion, of experience, of background. It's something that we take really seriously as anthropologists, those who do the kind of work that I do, that is, those of us who have the chance to make our living talking to people that we don't know that well, winding up in places where we don't quite belong, and trying to make sense of what life is like in those places and for those people from the inside out. It's something that I've been privileged to do as a way of making my living in the world, and it's a way of being in the company of others that I did try to make use of over these last few years in trying to make sense of these impasses that we seem to have fallen into in this country, and the challenge of developing other ways of relating to each other that might help with those real senses of impasse and a deep unknowing about where we go next. It takes a lot of patience. It takes certainly some faith in humanity and in the capacity that other people have to surprise you in ways that you didn't expect. And all of these are things that I felt were borne out by the research that I did, and I tried to convey that as best I could in the book itself.
Yeah, well, you definitely were, in my opinion, certainly successful in that. But speaking of the book, the title, comes from a quote by my favorite author, James Baldwin, who perhaps, more than anyone else in modern history, gives voice to both the adoration and repulsion that one can feel towards the Americans. He wrote that these are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there's something between us. So I want to ask you the question, what is the something between us that you are trying to better understand with this book?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. The quote, as you know, comes from a moment in this famous debate that he had with William F. Buckley at Cambridge University when they were talking through a range of differences in how they see the United States and what it means to live as an American at that time. That was in the 1960s. And Baldwin at that point is speaking about the experience of being a black man outside the United States and finding himself in the company of Americans, other Americans, white Americans who meet him with a sense of disdain, who feel the need to disavow the fact that they have a relationship. Baldwin is attesting to the presence, in other words, of a certain kind of invisible wall or barrier between them that disables the recognition of that common belonging in this United States with which he has such a difficult love, as he said. And yet, as he also goes on to say, at that particular moment, there is something between them insofar as they share this country and they share these relationships that are real, even if their reality can't always be avowed and acknowledged. And that's really what I'm wrestling with in this book. I'm wrestling with the difficult reality of interrelationships and interdependences we have with a range of others who also share this country with us, who share this society with us, who've made it what it is, and yet who, in many cases, seem to find an ever more tenuous place in this society, an ever more disavowed foothold in this country. And I want to take seriously both the reality of those interrelationships that weave us together as Americans, but also the everyday barriers of isolation and mistrust that make an honest and authentic recognition of those relationships so difficult and sometimes even impossible.
I really appreciate the way that you lean into the discomfort of a lot of these conversations throughout the book. Um, you have talked about approaching this as an anthropologist, someone who is familiar with the discomfort of coming into strange situations, strange places, and trying to make sense of them. You're also writing this book as someone whose previous work has focused on India, a country where a lot of your family is from. As I understand it, your family emigrated to the US when you were younger. Um, And in several cases, your identity put you in some pretty dangerous and uncomfortable circumstances while doing research. I'm thinking of the white nationalist rallies that you went to, or pained conversations with a fairly xenophobic political cartoonist in Georgia. Can you describe a little bit what it felt like to do this research from your position, and also why it felt important to do this type of a project despite what it was exposing you to?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's definitely a question I've wrestled with a lot over the years and thinking through the commitment I made to write a book like this or to
Mm,
try to research and write a book like this really the day after the presidential election in 2016, which is when I began thinking about the possibility of bringing my anthropological experience to bear on where we seem to have landed in this country. It's been a rocky road. The journey took me through, as I talk about in the book, fieldwork in more than a dozen states, different parts of the country, and hundreds of conversations, many of which were really heartwarming and affirming despite all the evident differences between myself and those I was speaking with, but others of which were quite difficult and sometimes even harrowing in a real visceral embodied sense. And I didn't take any of this lightly. I, I have a family. I have 2 kids who are actually quite young when I started doing this work, and my wife felt a great deal of trepidation, in fact, with regard to some of the research that I felt compelled to do. But the truth is, I did feel compelled to do it. I felt that there were things happening in the country with regard to racism, with regard to xenophobia, with regard to just a naked and outright hostile attitude, with regard to migrants, immigrants, refugees, and others who have made this country what it is, who the country depends on in ever so many ways, but whose presence seemed to have grown so intolerable to so many people, and a kind of intolerance that catapulted someone with no political experience into the White House. I wanted to understand all that, and I felt that I could do it as an anthropologist. I felt I could draw on my training to be able to do that, but I also felt compelled to do it as a citizen of this country, as someone who was born in the United States and whose family finally came back definitively to settle here when I was quite young, when I was 5, though my sister and I were born in the early '70s in New York. But I also felt compelled to do it as a father of brown children, and as someone whose whose family and friends had gone through difficult moments in these recent years, and I wanted to find some way of wrestling with that difficulty. And as you rightly say, I was trained to do my work as an anthropologist in South Asia, on the other side of the world, but it was it's a part of the world where people have very different ways, at least conventionally and traditionally, of thinking about relationships, of thinking about the line between insiders and outsiders, very different ways even of occupying physical space. The very question of what the inside of a house is and the outside of a house is feels completely different if so much of the domestic space is dedicated to, say, verandas and interior courtyards and all kinds of intermediate spaces that span that divide between insider and outsider in complicated ways, and I would say a personal familiarity with some of those social dynamics and spatial practices and habits really did bring for me into focus the unusual nature of these hard lines between inside and outside, insider and outsider that we seem to have fallen into in this country. It gave me a certain kind of critical perspective on where we seem to be going in this country. And it was that kind of perspective that I've tried to bring into focus in the journey that I take readers on in this book.
yeah, so I guess I am just curious because you talked about sort of 2016 being a catalyst for you to sort of embark upon some of the work that's featured in this book. So I do wonder in terms of what was your what perspective, I guess, did you have or insights did you have on 2024 when to be and I think you were being charitable when you said, electing a man who had no experience. I think he's just uniquely toxically horrible. But but how did when you look back at 2024, was there a surprise there? Was there did it just sort of confirm some of the things you had already sort of discovered in your work? Yeah, can you say more about that?
To be honest, I had trouble getting this book published.
Mm.
A lot of publishers turned down this particular book project because there was a feeling that it would be after the fact by the time it came out. That when we were thinking about Trumpism, we were thinking about the kinds of ideas that seem to have propelled that first successful presidential candidacy of his. We were thinking about a kind of flash in the pan, and that people would have moved on by the time the book saw the light of day.
So
So I
so is
actually
the lesson always bet on cynicism, or no, I'm
I
kidding.
The author's always right, Marcus.
There we go. There we go.
I'm not going to comment on that. We do what we can as scholars to kind of study and to pay attention. We look for patterns. We look for consistencies. We try to sort of play the long game in terms of how things are unfolding and evolving, and we try to suss things out. And sometimes, sometimes we're on the mark, and sometimes we're not. And you can't really say, to be honest. But in this case, I I was lucky to find, the publisher that I did, and had a wonderful relationship with Stanford University Press and Redwood Press, the imprint, that I wound up publishing the book with, and the editor, Dylan White, who I wound up working with. They were wonderful in terms of and the whole team there in terms of getting this book out, and as it happened, it landed at a time where people were wondering, well, how do we get right back to where we thought we'd gotten so far from some years ago? How did we? How did it turn out that we hadn't quite turned the corner as definitively as we thought we had? And as you know, the argument of the book is that if we want to understand phenomena like political polarization and ideological polarization, it isn't enough to simply look at the different ideas or philosophical commitments people have. You have to look at the way in which those differences are really baked into the infrastructure of people's lives. Infrastructures that have a much deeper and more enduring footprint. So I wound up making an argument about what happened in 2016 that invited folks to think about the deeper foundations for the forms of division, mistrust, and mutual suspicion that we continue to be locked in. And so when it so happened that things took that turn once again in 2024, and we wound up seeing a whole host of really difficult and inflammatory and, let's be honest, often quite harsh and even violent measures undertaken over the course of the early months of 2025. When the book appeared, it struck a certain kind of chord.
Well, and certainly the patterns of xenophobia, fear of the other, a really almost violent attitude towards, immigrant others, that you were picking up in a lot of conversations in this book have obviously become really, I would say, forefront of an entire policy agenda under the second Trump administration. I want to return to something you were pointing at, which is, I would say, a pretty substantial part of the first half of the book is actually looking not just at the sort of like emotional or political walls between us, but actual physical walls that have really encroached upon American life, from the walls of our homes and our communities to heavily armored and oversized cars that many of us are encouraged to drive. It seems like a lot of what you're describing in this book is a kind of, I don't know, like bunker politics, this sort of like arms race of escapism from public life. It's a in some ways similar to a conversation that we had with Doug Rushkoff earlier this year, talking about his book about sort of the escape fantasies of billionaires. But as I was reading this, I was sort of like, this is those escape fantasies brought down to a sort of middle class scale in some ways. What is it about our current politics, our current society in the US, do you think, that has elevated that kind of sort of bunker politics and bunker ways of living?
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the places that I went to for the book and that I talk about in the first chapter, a gated community in Central Florida, which the security manager of the community actually takes me around and gives me a tour of and speaks quite candidly with me as we're driving around this particular community and thinking about the really over the top lengths to which people seem to have gone here to protect themselves, to shield themselves from any kind of worry having to do with the world outside, the ways in which he himself was quite candid about a sort of culture of fear and anxiety that seemed to have infiltrated so deeply into the minds of residents in this community, such that what they needed more than anything else was the semblance of safety, the veneer of security, some kind of psychological reassurance, which was what all of these gates and walls and armed guards and so on, patrols and so on, were meant to sustain the feeling of security. It's definitely, I would say, something that we've come to associate with a kind of paranoid ruling class or a billionaire class. I think we know about these bunkers and compounds, but I think the reality is that that idea of securing yourself at any cost, of taking care of those you love by building the most effective walls between those you care about and those you don't want to think about as much. Like that way of building fear into the very grammar of our relationship with the outside world is actually quite ubiquitous now in contemporary American culture. That chapter begins with gated communities, but then follows these same patterns and dynamics into the building industry and looks at how features as banal and commonplace as domestic paint palettes are now oriented around these security concerns. All the smallest elements of everyday life in different built communities can reflect this. And as you know, there is a whole section of the book on our motor vehicles and the way in which SUVs and trucks have now come to take up 80% of the American automotive market, a market share that once again is so deeply predicated on the idea that those in the bigger vehicle are safer than those in the smaller vehicle, that there's something about the brick-like structure of these massive conveyances that is not only helpful in securing one's family and one's children and so on, but also necessary given all the range of uncertainties and dangers and so on that are out there. And so a lot of people have bought into this. But of course, as I also write about, the paradox in all this and the sad tragedy really in all this is that the more we do this kind of thing, the more intently we secure the inside at the expense of the outside, the more dangerous we can make that outside world. These larger vehicles are much more dangerous for pedestrians, cyclists, and other roadway users. Our massive bunker-like or increasingly sort of large and bunker-like homes just take that much more energy to heat and to cool and therefore are that much more consequential for the environment outside. There are all of these trade-offs that we unwittingly fall into when we buy into this idea that our safety and security is is best secured by capitulating to these fears that we've been fed. And yet that culture has a great deal of salience in the contemporary United States.
Yeah, I will say, reading that chapter, I've never felt prouder to drive a Ford EcoSport. So thank you for giving me, I don't have the same insecurities I once had with driving that thing around Seattle. But anyhow, I um, y- we live sort of at a time where it you have to have both courage and patience, I'd say, to have very difficult conversations with people. Um, and this book has a ton of profoundly difficult conversations. And you note the importance of having those conversations across what can seem like unbridgeable differences. Um, you write at length in both in the book and in a widely read essay in the Guardian about your ongoing conversation with Frank, which to me seems like a Thanksgiving dinner from hell. But Frank's a MAGA Republican and a COVID denialist. So I want to ask you, what is your advice to people about how to engage in and sustain these dialogues when, as you write in the book, everything seems to conspire against the very possibility of our conversing?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard, and after having done it all these years to write this particular book, I don't know that I'm any better at it than I was before, to be honest,
Oh,
because
no, I thought you had the secret.
Yeah, practice doesn't make perfect. My God.
I don't know. I don't know. Relationships are difficult. You know, we're complicated. Human beings are complicated. We are. We're complicated, and these are complicated times. And all of us, as complicated people, can become more complicated in complicated times, and that's just the reality of it. And I think that certainly in researching this book and in stumbling through a lot of difficult conversations and trying to learn how to talk with people I had so little in common with, and frankly, people whose visions of this country are so antithetical to my own. There's certainly things that I had to practice, right? Trying to kind of practice engaging with people in a spirit of listening, trying to keep an open mind, trying to to avoid the temptation of leading with a judgment or insisting that something was wrong right away instead of just hearing someone out. I mean, these are all some of the things that I suppose I learned to practice, and that I'd say all of us as anthropologists at some level have to learn to practice in the work that we do, because we are so often in the company of people whose basic ways of being in the world and looking at the world are so deeply different than our own. So these are all things I suppose that that I've had to learn how to do. I think in the end, though, it really comes down to the extent to which we take relationships seriously. I think that so much of this isolating technology and infrastructure that we have at our disposal, all of it is in some ways predicated on the fantasy that we can be just fine on our own. And that's just not true. It's not true. And if you look at what Frank, as I call him, it's a pseudonym, right? What Frank and I were arguing about again and again in that particular chapter that you mentioned, it was this question of whether or not we can just move about in the world as though we could just pay attention to ourselves and our own, or whether we don't instead have to acknowledge a deeper level of interdependence, a deeper level of social interdependence, a deeper level of ecological interdependence, a deeper level of vulnerability in a real sense that we have with regard to each other. I think that if we take those relationships seriously, if we take our implicatedness in the lives of others more seriously, if we take seriously the idea that whether we like it or not, whether we can stand it or not, we're still in relation in one way or another, I'd say it does dispose us to figure out what to do with each other's company. And sometimes it might simply be acknowledging the difficulty, acknowledging the impossibility of just staying with the impasse and at least facing it as honestly as possible. And at other times, it can grow into a different kind of conversation, a different kind of understanding, and quite frankly, the possibility of change, because that also happened in this book. For every relationship that I document that proved a dead end or wound up with a kind of impasse that was irrefutable and immovable, there are ever so many other encounters that I talk about in the book where people started out with one kind of position and wound up with another. People are complicated. They are changing, they are responding, they are learning. And I think that when we can bring as much patience as we can muster to these charged situations, it attunes us more effectively to that openness that other people also have, that we might find within ourselves as well.
Yeah, I think that's a stunning description of some of the politics that really emerged during COVID, of a politics of people who recognized interdependence versus a politics of people who didn't. And to me, that's, as someone who's in public health, that just felt like an almost unbridgeable divide that impacts so much of what we do day to day in the profession. Um, I want to ask a hard question.
Okay?
And I'm asking it because it's a question that I think Marcus and I have both struggled with and tried to kind of talk through in creating this podcast and thinking about, what voices are in the room. And it's a question we kind of run up against, which is sort of understanding the crucial importance of dialogue and conversation and finding common ground. And then also pretty frequently hearing from people, particularly people in marginalized or oppressed groups, who are saying, there's really a point at which I don't really want to have a conversation with someone who's denying my humanity or who is denying my right to live safely, right? And I think at the end of the book, you talk about kind of the difference between boundaries and walls. And I think that's somewhat of where the book takes us. But I guess I'm wondering how you approach that challenge in the work and whether these, kind of persisting in these really tough conversations with people like Frank changed your way of thinking about that difficulty of continuing to have conversations with people with whom there's not just a lot of shared common ground, but there's actually a fair amount of harm going on.
There is a lot of harm. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we face right now is figuring out how to reconcile the fact that what is so clearly harmful and so clearly violent, even in the experience and understanding of some people, feels to others in this country like exactly the natural and normal and proper thing to do. How do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of the personal investment that some people have in what amounts to real suffering in the lives of others? How do we reconcile ourselves with the evident glee and joy that you sometimes see evident in this country now in the really in the suffering and pain of others? How do we make sense of that? This is one of the most difficult things, I would say, about political and social life at present in this country. And these are conundrums, moral conundrums, and social conundrums that it may take us a long time to unravel. But my feeling is that one can at least begin to understand those impasses by getting a sense of how those commitments have the force they do, why they're as tenacious as they are, why some people can be so attached to things that other people find patently unlivable. And you can't do that from a distance very effectively. You can't do that from a distant outside. It takes a certain kind of proximity to understand how it is that those kinds of commitments, those attachments have the power and the force they do, which is why I pursued a lot of these more difficult conversations, not necessarily to persuade people or to find common ground. It's not what I was looking for example, that day that I spent at that white nationalist rally in Tennessee. It wasn't to somehow see eye to eye with folks who felt that they couldn't share a country with people that looked like me. It was more to try to understand where that sentiment came from, how someone could get to that point of refusing the very possibility of coexistence. That feels worthwhile understanding to me, but it's not work that everyone ought to do. And that's only one side of the book ultimately, because the book in pursuing those more difficult lines winds up taking quite seriously, as you know, other ways of thinking through our security and safety and ultimately our well-being that really do center our reliance on each other, that take seriously the importance of mutual aid, of collective caretaking, the kinds of lessons that came out of these pandemic years, the kinds of lessons that people that I've gotten to know here in Baltimore, for example, environmental justice activists that I've had the privilege of working closely with over some years now, that I also write about in the book, the kinds of lessons that they put into their own practice, like many of the other advocates for social change, for clean water, for safe roads, for gender justice, for racial justice, that I meet elsewhere in the country who promise, I'd say, a different way of thinking through this question of our relatedness. And I think that's ultimately where I see the most promise and really where I see the most hope in the lessons of that kind of work. But if you want to ensure that work of that kind has the foothold that it needs in a society as hostile and indifferent as ours can be, we also have to understand where the resistance comes from and where the pushback comes from. And so I'm really trying to understand this situation from both of those points of view.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because I'll say like one of the things that and I'm not sure if this was intended or not, but what I certainly one of the things that I took from the book was just the animating force that narratives are in American society. I mean, I think any society, right? But in the attachment that certain people have to certain narratives, and so I when you were talking earlier, sort of about the need for us to embrace our interdependence, I keep wondering how much sort of the American narrative of the rugged individual, the racial algebra myth that has been so prevalent in this society keeps us from, trying to adopt, at least in terms of a critical mass adoption, if you will, of new and I would say better narratives that more that are I guess just have more veracity when it comes to our society at this moment. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are really really dangerous and patently unlivable stories that we inherit, right? Stories that have gotten us into all kinds of trouble in this country and that have greatly complicated the relationship between this country and others in this hemisphere, in other parts of the world, that reflect the continuing legacies of enslavement, of colonialism, of imperialism, and all the ways in which particular notions of a kind of triumphal masculine self-assertion can really enact some very difficult outcomes for all kinds of societies and for all kinds of people. We see that in many ways even today. At the same time, I think one of the lessons that I'm working with in this book is that there's never been just one kind of narrative in this country. That a country that is founded on deep and systemic inequality, a country that's founded on the idea that some of its uh, members are fully human and fully vested with rights, while others just simply aren't, is necessarily going to be a country that also carries along with it other kinds of narratives. Subjugated, perhaps, marginal, perhaps, less audible, perhaps, but present all the same. Other ways of understanding one's place in that society, other ways of understanding what it takes to survive, other ways of understanding what it means to work toward a different kind of future that's less exclusionary, that's more honest about the full range of human experience that this country represents. And so when I'm thinking about the relationship between contemporary patterns of isolation and suspicion in this country and more long-standing histories of racial segregation and racial discrimination. And I'm also thinking about counter narratives that have to do with other forms of collective caretaking that marginalized communities all over this country have had to practice as an alternative form of survival, the modes of self-imagination that those other stories sustain and propel, and what we can learn from them even now. I think that there are wonderful examples of that all over the United States. And I was really privileged to meet people, who convey, let's say, that more expansive and frankly more human way of thinking about ourselves in relation to others. Uh, that that I also try to give some space for in the narrative, and I think it's important to try to open up the space of our imaginations, the space of our storytelling, to ensure that other kinds of stories that tell different kinds of truths about who we really are in relation to others actually have the space and the light to flourish as they need.
Yeah, I think the book brings that forward really beautifully. Um, Maybe we can end with just a quick, slightly more uplifting question. Reading through the book, I kept thinking of that sign that everyone carried in the protests in like 2016, 2017 of like, build bridges, not walls. And so I think your book is pointing towards bridges that could be built or are sort of slowly being built across American life. Are there any particular examples of unexpected solidarity or these sort of moments of bridges that came out during the research that you are holding on to in this moment in time when it feels like so much else is being divided among us?
Yeah, I've I've had a really interesting year or an interesting few months since the book came out because I've had the chance to travel around a bit and talk about it in different places. And I'd say at this point, I've actually spoken about the book in the majority of places where its chapters are set. So I've had really interesting conversations, for example, at a community library in Newburgh in upstate New York, at a bookstore in Los Angeles, at a bookstore on the town square in Denton, Texas, that I write about in one of the chapters when I talk about the generations of anti-racist organizing that led to the dismantling of the Confederate monument on that very square. There was a lovely evening that I had in October in the company of pretty much everyone that I got to write about in that particular chapter who showed up that night, including the mayor of the town, Gerard Hudspeth, who was there along with his father, Willie Hudspeth, who was the activist who was most responsible for the dismantling of that particular monument. And that conversation that night in Denton began as a conversation about the book, but then turned into a conversation about the future, where the fact that the book existed and the fact that it drew a pretty diverse crowd to that bookstore, Recycle Books, that night on the courthouse square in Denton, it propelled a series of questions and reflections on what it would mean to try to continue to do justice to the violent history of racism in Denton, what it means to acknowledge now, or to continue to acknowledge the hardship posed by the expulsion of Denton's Black population, the dismantling of this prosperous township at the heart of that city, at the heart of that town a century ago, and all the different strategies of survival that people have mustered up in the years since, and all the work that they've done to make a living, and to hold on to a different picture of what that town could be, even to this day. And it became an interesting discussion of what reparation could look like now, and whether the whites-only park that now exists on the site of this former Black township could in fact be given over for some other purpose, with some other vision of social justice. People are asking those questions, and it was such a gift to have the book itself become an occasion in which people could actually talk with each other in the town about what it would mean to address such questions with the seriousness they deserve. The point is, people are asking the questions, people are doing the work, people are still organizing, they're protecting each other, they're looking out for people who are ever more vulnerable on account of some of the really difficult acts of heedless state violence that we've seen in recent months. And things are happening at different scales all around the country that are more promising, I would say, than what we might find solely at the national level. And that does give me a lot of hope. And I think that there's an enormous amount of insight and wisdom that people carry on account of the generations of struggle that they've been involved with in hanging on to a more open and inclusive picture of what this country has been and what it still could be. And I think we can all do a better job of seeking out those folks, of thinking about what solidarity and support for people doing that work could look like in our different localities, and just stopping to imagine what this country could be if such visions were eventually realized.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end on than that. Um, this conversation has been so wonderful, but it doesn't begin to touch the really extraordinary set of stories that are in this book. So we'll just plug the book one more time. It's called Something Between Us, and we'll put it up on our book list. And thank you so much for sharing a bit of it with us.
Thank you so much for the chance to talk with you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Nora, I again, that was to me another A plus, first class conversation. I will say, like, it really struck. I mean, much of this conversation struck me, right? But it really struck me though, specifically around we talked about, the narratives that we tell ourselves and that we attach ourselves to. It reminded me a lot, actually, of the conversation that we had a while back with Trisha Rose, and she was talking
Mhm.
about meta narratives and
Yep.
how they're ingrained into our society and act as an operating system, which then we sort of projects upon the rest of society. So this was, in some ways, this was a very complimentary conversation to that one as well.
I agree. Yeah, and I really like the emphasis on the value of vulnerability and interdependence. I think that's another theme that's come up in a lot of our conversations, and at least for me, I've been driving around in traffic today and really thinking about um, the walls of that experience and really trying to
Mm.
think about what sort of walls are in my everyday life and how I might sort of try and lower them a little bit. So, a lot of practical applications there as well.
Yeah, I would say lowering the walls is certainly not easy to do.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's been centimeter by centimeter as opposed to foot by foot.
Yeah.
But I'm like we say in this episode, we're learning in real time, and we were doing our best to do our best. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Should we turn to our 8 ounces?
let us do it. You want to go first, Nora?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think mine is actually related to something that Anand said at the end of his conversation with us about sort of the experience of traveling around the country and having these conversations with people in places like Denton, Texas, and just realizing how much is happening on the ground and how much is how much of the fight is really there. Um, I've also been traveling for the last couple weeks, and I ran into a couple while I was traveling from a very small town, Red, Idaho. And when I first met them, I was like kind of dancing around the political stuff. I was like making my assumptions. Shame
Right.
on me. And then they sort of outed themselves as progressives, and it turns out the wife in this couple actually does refugee resettlement in
Oh wow.
Idaho, and the husband does environmental and climate change communications work. And they were just in it.
Mm,
They were talking about how hard it is to do that work right now in the place where they are,
I imagine.
about feeling like they had to send their kids off to other states for college so that they would be safe. Um, but also the importance to them of doing that work in that place. And they said they were on this trip to try and like refill their cup and be able to come back and do it
Mm,
some more. And I just was filled with awe and appreciation for these just everyday normal Americans who are doing such hard work in such hard circumstances and feeling the call of it and just continuing to figure out how to do it. And it was just a really good reminder for me about the assumptions I make sometimes about people from places like rural Idaho, despite the fact that I'm from a rural Western state as well. And also the importance of remembering that there are really good people doing really good work in lots and lots of places.
no, absolutely. And I mean, to your point, right? I mean, we sort of start every episode with like the worst of of
Maybe
society at
we
the
should
moment.
work on that a little
I
bit.
well, I like that we ended everything on a high note,
Okay.
right? I mean, we get the bad out of the way. Yeah, that's a great 8 ounces of joy, Nora. I would say for mine, it's a super brief thing. It's been a real tough week in terms of some of the stories that I'm in the process of either covering
Hmm.
or uh, aren't covering myself, but know about in my sort of direct community. And it's without getting into detail, it's sent a lot of community members reeling and just feeling sort of a sense of betrayal in many areas. And so it was, I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of tough to find um 8 ounces of joy this
Yeah.
week. However, um, I what I used to do even before the show was when I was feeling um, at a loss. I would try to find other people's words, to help uplift me. And um, I recently came across these words from Tennessee Williams, the playwright, and
Mm.
he wrote famously. I think his most famous play is A Streetcar Named Desire. I've
Stella.
yeah,
Sorry.
I've that is literally all I know about that play. I have never actually seen any of Tennessee Williams's plays, and I most likely should. I'm sorry. I'm not as cultured as I probably come across as at times, or maybe I don't. But anyway, but I thought these words were so great, and they're so just because of their prescience, but also their persistence in life. In terms of I think there'll never be a time in the history of humanity that we can't look back on these words and they resonate. And so anyway, Tennessee Williams wrote, "The world is violent and mercurial. It will have its way with you. We are saved only by love for each other, and the love that we pour into the art we feel compelled to share. Being a parent, being a writer, being a painter, being a friend, we live in a perpetually burning building, and what we must save from it all the time is love." So,
That's amazing. Oh,
yeah, I
gosh.
I don't know what else he wrote, but I mean, he could have stopped there. I think that's just like perfect,
Yeah.
quite frankly.
I'm gonna
And
need you to like read it again once we're done recording so I can write it down. That I need that like on a sticky note,
I'm
Marcus.
saying that it should be a meme somewhere. But anyhow, I think on that note, Nora, shall we go ahead and sign off?
Yes. Well, if the holiday season feels longer to you than a Hallmark movie marathon, or if your family can't even crack open a can of cranberry sauce without shouting about QAnon, your company is still welcome here anytime.
Oh, yes, it is.
And because it's also the season for giving, we hope you'll also give a donation to support us at inthemeanwhilepodcast.com.
Yes, and we want to thank today's guest, Anand Pandian, for sharing his book and wisdom with us. As always, we are ever so grateful to our producer, Jessica Partnow, and to Aham Aluo for the music on this show. You can find In the Meanwhile by tuning into KBRU Wednesdays at 5 p.m. or find our full episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky.
New episodes drop every Friday. Until then, we'll see you in the meanwhile.